I still remember the smell of the hospital that night, antiseptic mixed with something I couldn't name, something that felt like fear. Sarah's hand gripped mine so tightly I thought she might break my fingers, but I didn't care. We'd been waiting for this moment for 9 months, picking out names, painting the nursery pale yellow because we wanted it to be a surprise. "Push, Sarah! He's almost here!" Dr. Martinez called out, her voice cutting through the chaos of monitors beeping and nurses moving with practiced urgency. And then suddenly, silence. I watched Dr. Martinez's face change, watched the smile fade into something else entirely. She worked quickly, quietly, while Sarah panted and asked what was happening. I kept waiting for the cry, that first wail that would announce our son's arrival to the world. But it never came. "I'm sorry," Dr. Martinez said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes these things happen. There was nothing we could have done." The next few hours blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Forms to sign, arrangements to make. Sarah sobbing into my chest while I stood there, numb, trying to process that our son, our perfect, beautiful son, was gone before he'd even had a chance to live. My mother arrived at the hospital before dawn, still in her pink bathrobe and slippers, her grey hair askew from sleep. She held Sarah while I made the phone calls I couldn't bear to make, her voice low and soothing as she whispered the kinds of things mothers say when the world falls apart. "These things happen for a reason, sweetheart," she murmured to Sarah. "Sometimes God needs his angels more than we do." I wanted to scream at her platitudes, but I didn't have the strength. Instead, I let her handle the arrangements, grateful that someone could think clearly when my mind felt like it was wrapped in cotton. The funeral was small. A tiny white casket that seemed impossibly empty, surrounded by flowers that smelled too sweet. Sarah couldn't stop crying, and I couldn't start. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything important out of my chest and left me walking around as an empty shell. In the months that followed, Sarah and I tried to piece our lives back together. We went to counseling. We took a trip to Maine that we couldn't afford. We talked about trying again someday when the wound didn't feel so raw. But something had broken between us that night in the hospital, and no amount of talking seemed to fix it. Sarah threw herself into her work at the marketing firm, staying late every night and bringing projects home on weekends. I buried myself in my construction job, taking on extra shifts and overtime until my hands were permanently stained with sawdust and my back ached constantly. We moved through our days like ghosts in the same house, polite and distant, two people who had loved each other deeply but couldn't figure out how to do it anymore. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 18 months after we lost our son. I signed them without argument. What was the point of fighting for something that was already dead? I moved into a one-bedroom apartment across town, taking only my clothes, my tools, and a single photograph from the hospital. The only picture we had of our son taken before everything went wrong. In it, he looked perfect, peaceful, like he was just sleeping. I kept it on my bedside table and tried not to look at it too often. The next few years passed in a haze of routine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. I dated a few women, but never seriously. How do you explain to someone that you're still grieving a child they'll never meet? That part of you died in a hospital room 5 years ago, and you're not sure it'll ever come back. I moved to a different apartment, then another. I got promoted to site supervisor. I bought a used truck, normal things that normal people do, but they all felt like I was going through the motions of someone else's life. My mother and I talked every few weeks, the conversation stilted and careful. She'd ask how I was doing, and I'd say fine, and she'd tell me about her book club or her garden or whatever new restaurant she'd tried. Neither of us mentioned Sarah. Neither of us mentioned the baby. It was like we'd all agreed to pretend that part of our lives had never happened. Then came the phone call that changed everything. "Michael, honey, I need you to come over." Mum's voice sounded strange, shaky in a way I'd never heard before. It was a Saturday morning in March, almost exactly 5 years since we'd lost our son. I'd been planning to spend the day organizing my apartment, maybe catch a game on TV. "What's wrong?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "Just, please come over. Now." The drive to her house took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Mom lived in the same tidy ranch-style home where I'd grown up, with its carefully maintained garden and the wooden swing my father had built for me before he died when I was 12. She was waiting on the front porch when I pulled up, still in her nightgown and robe, her face pale and drawn. "Mom, what's going on? Are you sick?" She shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "Come inside, Michael. Please." I followed her into the living room, the same room where she'd taught me to play chess, where we'd watched countless movies together, where she'd held me when I cried after Dad's funeral. She sat heavily on the floral couch and patted the cushion beside her. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely audible. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." My stomach dropped. "Mom, you're scaring me." She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for years. "Your baby didn't die, Michael." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt the room spin around me. "What?" "He's alive. He's been alive all this time." Tears were streaming down her face now, and her hands shook as she reached for a tissue. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." I stood up abruptly, backing away from her. That's not possible. We saw him. We buried him." "No," she whispered. "You buried an empty casket. I arranged it all. The funeral home, the death certificate, everything." The room tilted sideways. I gripped the back of a chair to keep from falling. "Why would you? I don't understand. Why would you do that?" Mom's face crumpled. "Because I thought it was best. For everyone. Sarah was so young, and you two weren't ready to be parents. You didn't have money, you were both still figuring out your lives. And the baby." She paused, struggling with the words. "The baby was born with problems, serious problems. The doctors said he might never walk, might never speak normally. They said he'd need constant care, expensive treatments. So you decided he was better off dead?" The words came out as a roar, and I saw her flinch. "I decided he was better off with a family who could give him what he needed," she shot back, then immediately deflated. "I know how it sounds. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I found him a good home, Michael. A wonderful family who had been trying to have children for years. They had the resources, the knowledge, the love to help him." I was pacing now, my hands clenched into fists. "You had no right. No right to make that decision for us." "I know," she whispered. "I know that now. I've known it every day for 5 years. But at the time, I thought I was protecting you, protecting all of you." "What's his name?" The question came out before I could stop it. "What? His name? What do they call him?" Mom's shoulders sagged. "Daniel. Daniel Morrison. Daniel. We'd planned to name him Daniel if it was a boy, after my father. The fact that his adoptive parents had chosen the same name felt like a cosmic joke." "Where is he?" "Michael, where is he?" She jumped at my shout. "Here, in town, the Morrisons. They never moved. They wanted to stay close, in case someday you wanted to know." My legs gave out, and I collapsed back onto the couch. 5 years. My son had been alive for 5 years, living 20 minutes away from me, and I'd never known. I'd grieved him, mourned him, let him destroy my marriage and my life, and he'd been alive all this time. "How bad?" I asked, finally. "What?" "His problems. How bad are they?" Mom wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He has cerebral palsy. It affects his legs mostly. He uses braces to walk, and his speech is a little slow. But Michael, he's wonderful. He's smart and funny, and... You've seen him?" The betrayal hit me fresh. "You've been watching my son grow up." "Only from a distance, a few times. I needed to know he was okay." I stood up again, my whole body shaking with rage and grief and something else I couldn't name. I need to see him. Michael, wait. We need to think about this. The Morrisons, they don't know the truth. They think his birth parents died in a car accident. If you just show up. I don't care. I was already moving toward the door. You've had 5 years to think. I'm done thinking. The drive through town felt surreal. Every familiar landmark. The grocery store where Sarah and I used to shop, the park where we'd imagined pushing our son on the swings, the elementary school where we'd pictured him learning to read all of it looked different now, charged with new meaning. My son was out there somewhere, in this town, breathing and laughing and living a life I'd never been part of. I drove aimlessly at first, not sure where to start looking. Then I remembered what Mom had said about the name Morrison and pulled over to look them up on my phone. There were 3 Morrison families in the phone book, but only one with the initial R. Robert Morrison on Maple Street. Maple Street was in the good part of town, where the houses had large yards and 2-car garages. Number 1247 was a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a basketball hoop in the driveway. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree in the front yard, and I could see toys scattered on the porch. I sat in my truck across the street for over an hour, just watching. A woman came out to check the mail. Mid-40s, dark hair, wearing yoga pants and a sweater. She looked happy, relaxed, like someone whose biggest worry was whether to make chicken or pasta for dinner. A few minutes later, a man appeared in the doorway, calling something to her that made her laugh. They looked like good people, the kind of people who would help their child with homework and read bedtime stories and never miss a soccer game. The kind of parents I'd wanted to be. But they weren't his parents. I was. I started the truck and drove home, my mind racing. I needed a plan. I couldn't just knock on their door and announce that I was Daniel's father. Mom was right about that much. It would destroy their world, and probably his too. But I had to see him. I had to know that he was real, that he was okay. The answer came to me the next morning. The elementary school. If Daniel was 5, he'd be in kindergarten. I could find out which schools served the Maple Street area, and maybe catch a glimpse of him there. Hillcrest Elementary was a brick building with colourful murals painted on the side and a playground full of swings and slides. I felt like a criminal, sitting in my truck in the parking lot, but I didn't know what else to do. The school day ended at 3:15 and parents started arriving around 3 o'clock to pick up their kids. I watched as children poured out of the building, backpacks bouncing, voices raised in excitement about the coming afternoon. I scanned each small face, looking for... what? My own features reflected back at me, some instinctive recognition. Then I saw him. He was smaller than the other kids, walking carefully with the help of metal braces on his legs. Dark hair, serious expression, clutching a folder against his chest. And his face. God, his face was mine at that age. The same stubborn chin, the same dark eyes, the same way of tilting his head when he was concentrating. My son. My living, breathing, beautiful son. I watched as the woman from Maple Street, his adoptive mother, bent down to help him with his backpack, her movements gentle and practiced. She said something that made him smile, and the brightness of that smile nearly stopped my heart. He was happy. Despite everything, the disability, the lie that had shaped his life, he was happy. I started going to the school every day after that. I told myself I was just checking on him, making sure he was okay, but the truth was, I couldn't stay away. I learned his routine. He arrived at 8:30 in a blue Honda Pilot, always running a few minutes late. His adoptive father dropped him off on Tuesdays and Thursdays. His mother handled the other days. He played on the adapted playground equipment during recess, had speech therapy on Mondays and Wednesdays, and always carried the same Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles lunchbox. I learned other things too. His laugh was infectious, causing other kids to giggle even when they hadn't heard the joke. He was friends with a little girl named Emma, who always waited for him at the bottom of the slide. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, seemed particularly patient with him, often crouching down to his level to talk to him face to face. He was thriving. That was the hardest part to accept. The family that had stolen my son, because that's what they'd done, even if they didn't know it, had given him a good life. Maybe better than Sarah and I could have provided. The thought made me sick with guilt and rage, and something else I didn't want to examine too closely. 3 weeks into my daily surveillance, everything changed. I was sitting in my usual spot across from the school when I heard someone tap on my passenger window. I turned to see a police officer, young, serious-looking, hand resting casually on his belt. "Excuse me, sir. Could you step out of the vehicle?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We've had some reports of a man in a truck watching the children. Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" I got out slowly, hands visible, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. I was thinking about enrolling my kid here. Wanted to see what the school was like." He nodded, but his eyes remained skeptical. "And your child is—" He lives with his mother right now. Custody thing." The lies came easier than I'd expected. The officer took down my name and license plate number, but let me go with a warning about loitering near schools. I drove home with shaking hands, knowing I couldn't go back. At least, not like that. But I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. The image of his face, so much like mine, was burned into my memory. I found myself driving past Maple Street at night, slowing down just enough to see the glow of lights in the windows, imagining the family inside. Were they reading him bedtime stories? Helping him with bath time? Tucking him in with that same gentle patience I'd observed at school? The questions ate at me. I started having dreams about him sometimes as the baby we'd lost, sometimes as the boy I'd watched on the playground. I'd wake up feeling like I'd been punched in the chest, the grief fresh and raw all over again. I stopped calling my mother. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, to be reminded of what she'd done. When she tried to call me, I let it go to voicemail. Her messages started desperate and ended resigned. Work became my only refuge. I took on more projects, stayed later, pushed myself harder. My crew started joking that I was trying to build the whole city single-handedly. If only they knew I was just trying to build something solid enough to hold myself together. 2 months after the incident with the police officer, I was at Home Depot picking up supplies when I heard a familiar voice. "Daddy, can we get the blue paint?" I turned around, and there he was. Daniel, sitting in a shopping cart while his adoptive father, Robert Morrison, I'd learned from my online research, pushed him through the paint aisle. They were debating the merits of sky blue versus navy for what sounded like a treehouse project. "I think sky blue would look better with the yellow trim, don't you?" Robert asked, holding up paint chips for Daniel to see. Daniel studied them with the same serious concentration I'd observed at school. "Yeah, but navy is stronger." "Stronger how?" "Like the ocean. The ocean is strong." Robert smiled and ruffled Daniel's hair. "Ocean blue it is, then." I followed them at a distance, 3 aisles over, listening to their easy chatter about wood screws and rope swings. Robert was patient with Daniel's slower walking pace, never rushing him or making him feel like a burden. When Daniel asked to look at the power tools, Robert lifted him up so he could see better, explaining how each one worked. "When I'm bigger, can I help you build things?" Daniel asked. "When you're bigger, you can build your own things," Robert replied. "And I'll help you." The love in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just duty or obligation. Robert Morrison genuinely adored this boy. My boy. I left the store without buying anything. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the photo on my bedside table, the only picture I had of my son. He looked so tiny in it, so fragile. Nothing like the vibrant, happy child I'd seen in the store. Had I been wrong to want him back? Had my mother, despite the awful way she'd gone about it, been right? The questions tormented me for weeks. I found myself driving past the Morrison house more frequently, watching for signs of Daniel in the windows. Once, I saw him in the backyard, playing on a swing set that had been specially adapted for his needs. Another time, I watched him and Robert working together on what looked like a vegetable garden, Daniel's small hands carefully patting soil around seedlings. Spring melted into summer. I took a job in the next town over, partly to stay busy and partly to put some distance between myself and the daily temptation to drive by Maple Street. But no amount of distance could quiet the voice in my head that kept asking the same question. What kind of father walks away from his child twice? The answer came to me on a Thursday evening in July. I was driving home from the job site when I passed Hillcrest Elementary and saw cars parked around the building, families walking toward the entrance carrying covered dishes and folding chairs. A banner stretched across the front entrance. Summer Family Fun Night. I parked across the street and watched parents and children file into the school. It was the kind of event Sarah and I had imagined attending with our son potluck dinners and game booths and kids running around with painted faces while their parents chatted over paper plates. I was about to drive away when I saw them, the Morrisons, walking slowly across the parking lot. Robert carried a casserole dish while his wife, I still didn't know her first name, held Daniel's hand. Daniel was dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, his leg braces barely visible under his pants. Without thinking, I got out of my truck and followed them inside. The school gym had been transformed into a carnival of sorts. Game booths lined the walls, staffed by older students and parent volunteers. A face-painting station had been set up near the stage, and tables laden with food filled the center of the room. The air buzzed with conversation and children's laughter. I bought a plate of food I didn't want and found a corner where I could watch Daniel without being too obvious. He moved through the room with the confidence of a child who was well loved and secure in his place in the world. Other kids greeted him by name, including him naturally in their games and conversations. His parents stayed close, but not hovering, letting him navigate the social landscape while keeping a watchful eye. He's doing really well this year. I turned to find a woman standing beside me, middle-aged, wearing a name tag that identified her as Mrs. Rodriguez, Daniel's teacher. "I'm sorry," I said, confused. "Daniel Morrison. I saw you watching him. Are you thinking of enrolling a child here? He's one of my students, and I always like to brag about how well he's adapted." My mouth went dry. Adapted to what? The school environment. When he started kindergarten, we weren't sure how he'd handle the social aspects. You know, kids can be cruel about differences. But Daniel has such a positive attitude, and his parents have done such a wonderful job preparing him. He's really flourished. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "The Morrisons are amazing," she continued. "They've been through so much with him, all the therapies, the surgeries, the equipment adaptations. But you'd never hear them complain. They just focus on helping him be the best Daniel he can be." Surgeries. The word hit me like a sledgehammer. Surgeries? Oh yes, several. His cerebral palsy required multiple operations to help with his mobility. The first one was when he was just 8 months old, can you imagine? But each surgery has helped him gain more independence. He's walking so much better now than when he started school. 8 months old. My son had undergone surgery at 8 months old, and I hadn't even known he was alive. While I'd been drowning in grief and guilt, he'd been lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by people who weren't his biological family. "Excuse me," I managed, and pushed through the crowd toward the exit. I made it to my truck before the panic attack hit. My chest felt like it was being crushed, and I couldn't get enough air. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to breathe, tried to process what I'd learned. My son had suffered. Multiple surgeries, therapies, medical procedures I couldn't even imagine. And I hadn't been there for any of it. I'd been wallowing in self-pity while he'd been fighting battles I didn't even know existed. When I could finally breathe again, I looked up to see Daniel through the school's windows. He was at the face-painting booth, sitting very still while a teenager painted what looked like a superhero mask around his eyes. When it was finished, he admired himself in a hand mirror and broke into that brilliant smile. He looked happy. Despite everything, the disability, the surgeries, the lie that defined his existence, he looked genuinely, completely happy. I drove home and called my mother for the first time in months. Michael? Her voice was cautious, hopeful. Tell me about the surgeries, I said without preamble. A long pause. You've seen him? Tell me. She sighed, and I could picture her sinking into her kitchen chair, the one by the window where she did her crossword puzzles. The first one was to release some tight muscles in his legs. Then there was another one to lengthen his tendons. The most recent was to correct some bone alignment issues. How do you know all this? I kept in touch with the family. Not directly, but through the adoption agency. They send updates. Another betrayal, another secret she'd kept from me, but I found I didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. What else? He's had years of physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. He's incredibly determined, Michael. The reports say he works harder than most adult patients. My 5-year-old son was braver than I was. The thought should have made me proud, but instead it filled me with shame. I want to meet them, I said. The Morrisons. Yes, I want them to know who I am. Michael, think about what you're saying. These people have raised Daniel for 5 years. They've been through every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every sleepless night. They've sacrificed everything for him. If you reveal the truth now, the truth is that he's my son. The truth is more complicated than that. She was right, and I hated her for it. We argued for another hour, going in circles. She begged me to think about Daniel's best interests. I accused her of playing God with our lives. We both said things we couldn't take back, and when I finally hung up, I felt more alone than ever. But I'd made up my mind. I needed to meet the Morrisons, even if it meant destroying everything Daniel had ever known as true. I spent the next week planning what I would say, how I would approach them. I imagined a dozen different scenarios, from showing up at their door unannounced to writing them a letter. None of them felt right. In the end, fate made the decision for me. I was at the grocery store on a Saturday morning when I saw Robert Morrison in the cereal aisle, studying nutrition labels with the focused attention of a parent trying to make healthy choices. He looked older up close, with grey threading through his brown hair and laugh lines around his eyes. "Excuse me," I said, my heart hammering. "Are you Robert Morrison?" He looked up, friendly but cautious. "Yes." "Do we know each other?" "My name is Michael Chen. I need to talk to you about your son." His expression changed instantly, protective walls slamming into place. "What about Daniel? Is there somewhere we could talk? Privately?" He glanced around the store, then back at me. "What is this about?" The words stuck in my throat. How do you tell a man that his entire family is built on a lie? How do you explain that you're about to destroy his world because you need to reclaim something that was stolen from you? "I'm Daniel's biological father." The color drained from his face. He gripped his shopping cart like it was the only thing keeping him upright. That's not possible. Daniel's parents died in a car accident." "That's what they told you. It's not true." We stared at each other across the cereal aisle, two fathers of the same boy, both of us reeling from the implications of this moment. "I think," Robert said slowly, "we need to have a very long conversation." We ended up at a coffee shop downtown, sitting across from each other at a small table while I told him everything. About the night Daniel was born, about my mother's deception, about the empty casket we'd buried. He listened without interrupting, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked like grief. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. 5 years, he finally said. "We've been his parents for 5 years." "I know. We got up with him every night when he had surgery complications. We held him when he cried because the other kids could run faster. We celebrated when he took his first steps with the leg braces. We've been there for everything." Each word was a knife in my chest. "I know. And now you want to take him away from us." "I don't know what I want." He looked up at me then, and I saw the same desperation I felt reflected in his eyes. What kind of man does something like this? What kind of person waits 5 years and then shows up to destroy a child's life? The kind of person whose mother lied to him for 5 years about his child being dead. Or, we glared at each other, two men who loved the same boy, both of us drowning in impossible choices. "What do you want from us?" Robert asked finally. "I want to know my son. He has parents." "I want to know my son," I repeated. Robert's jaw clenched. "You have no legal rights. The adoption was finalized years ago. Your adoption was based on fraud." "We didn't know that." "I'm not blaming you." The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "But that doesn't change the fact that my son thinks I'm dead." We sat there for another hour, going in circles, getting nowhere. Robert told me about Daniel's first word, ball, his first steps, at 18 months, later than most kids because of the cerebral palsy, his first day of school. He'd been nervous, but excited. I told him about the nursery Sarah and I had painted, about the name we'd chosen, about the hole his supposed death had torn in our lives. By the end, we were both exhausted and no closer to a solution. "I need to talk to my wife," Robert said as we prepared to leave. "I need to see him," I replied. I can't just let you into his life. You have to understand that. And you have to understand that I'm not going away." We left it, at that an impasse, wrapped in mutual understanding of each other's pain. I didn't hear from Robert for 3 days. When he finally called, his voice sounded like he'd aged years in the interim. "My wife wants to meet you," he said. We met at the same coffee shop. Jennifer Morrison was smaller than she'd seemed from a distance, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that looked like she'd been crying recently. She studied me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You look like him," she said after a moment. "Around the eyes?" I nodded, not sure how to respond. "Robert told me everything. About your mother, about the lies, about what happened to you and your wife." Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking slightly. "I'm trying to understand how someone could do that to their own child." "So am I." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving mine. "But what I don't understand is what you expect from us now. Daniel is our son. We've raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him. We're the only parents he's ever known. I'm not trying to take him away from you." "Then what are you trying to do?" The question I'd been asking myself for weeks. "I'm trying to figure out how to live with knowing my son is alive, and I can't be part of his life." Jennifer's expression softened slightly. "And we're trying to figure out how to live with knowing that everything Daniel believes about his origins is a lie." We talked for 2 hours. Jennifer told me about Daniel's personality, how he was funny and stubborn and incredibly determined, how he loved dinosaurs and superhero movies and insisted on wearing his Superman cape to bed, how he'd once spent an entire afternoon trying to teach their cat to walk on its hind legs because it wasn't fair that some animals got 4 legs and some got 2. In return, I told them about my father, who Daniel would never know, about the family traditions that should have been passed down to him, about the resemblance between Daniel's determination and my father's stubborn refusal to give up on anything he cared about. By the end of the conversation, we weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. We were 3 adults trying to navigate an impossible situation, all of us united by our love for the same little boy. "I have an idea," Jennifer said as we prepared to leave. "It's not perfect, and it might not work, but—" "What?" "What if we told Daniel that we'd found some relatives, distant cousins or something, people who wanted to get to know him?" Robert frowned. "You want to lie to him again?" "I want to protect him," she shot back. "At least until we figure out how to handle all this." "And then what?" I asked. "At some point, he's going to want to know the truth. Then we'll tell him the truth, when he's old enough to understand it." It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A way for me to be part of Daniel's life without destroying the world the Morrisons had built for him. "There would have to be rules," Robert said slowly. "Of course. You couldn't just show up whenever you wanted. It would have to be planned, supervised." "I understand." Jennifer looked between us. "And if Daniel ever asks questions we can't answer, or if this starts to hurt him in any way, it stops immediately. Agreed. We shook hands on it, three strangers bound together by love and lies and the hope that somehow we could make this work. The first meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at a local park. I arrived early and sat on a bench, watching other families play on the playground equipment. Fathers pushing their children on swings, mothers helping toddlers navigate the climbing structure, older kids racing each other to the top of the slide. Normal family moments I'd never had. When the Morrisons arrived, Daniel between them holding both their hands, my breath caught in my throat. He was wearing a red t-shirt with a cartoon dinosaur on it and sneakers that lit up when he walked. His leg braces were barely noticeable under his jeans. Jennifer had clearly prepared him for this meeting. He approached me with curious but cautious eyes, staying close to Robert's side. "Daniel, this is Michael," Jennifer said gently. "He's the cousin we told you about." "Hi," Daniel said softly. "Hi, Daniel. It's really nice to meet you." He studied my face with that serious expression I'd come to recognize. "You look like me a little bit." My chest tightened. "Do you think so?" He nodded. "Same chin. Mom says I have a stubborn chin." Robert laughed, the sound strained but genuine. "That's because you are stubborn." "I'm determined," Daniel corrected, and I had to bite back a smile. That was pure Daniel refusing to accept anyone else's definition of him. We spent an hour at the park. I pushed Daniel on the swings while the Morrisons watched from a nearby bench. He told me about his school, his friends, his favorite TV shows. Normal 5-year-old chatter that felt like the most precious gift I'd ever received. "Are you really my cousin?" he asked as I helped him down from the swing set. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced over at Jennifer, who was watching us with worried eyes. "I'm family," I said finally. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Daniel seemed satisfied with that answer. "Good. I don't have very much family." If only he knew. That first meeting led to others. Once a week, sometimes twice, I'd meet Daniel and the Morrisons at various public places, parks, museums, the zoo. I watched my son discover the world through eyes unclouded by the grief and pain that had defined my own experience of his existence. He was remarkable. Not despite his cerebral palsy, but simply as himself, a little boy who found wonder in everything from butterfly wings to construction cranes. His physical challenges were just part of who he was, like his dark eyes or his infectious laugh. He never complained about the leg braces or the extra time it took him to do things. He just adapted, found different ways to accomplish his goals, and moved on. "Why do you use those?" I asked one day, pointing to his braces as we sat on a blanket having a picnic. "Because my legs work different," he said matter-of-factly, taking a bite of his sandwich. "But look what I can do with them." He stood up and did a little dance that made the metal parts of his braces jingle like bells. "Robot dance," I laughed despite the tightness in my throat. "That's pretty cool." Dad says everyone's body works different. Some people need glasses to see, some people need braces to walk. It's just the way things are. Robert caught my eye over Daniel's head and gave me a small nod. Even in the midst of this complicated situation, he was raising my son to be confident, accepting, and resilient. I had to respect that. As the weeks passed, Daniel began to open up to me more. He showed me his drawings' elaborate scenes of dinosaurs and superheroes that he created with painstaking detail. He taught me the rules to various playground games and insisted I participate, even when my adult-sized body made me clumsy on the child-sized equipment. "You're funny, Michael," he told me one afternoon as I extracted myself awkwardly from a too-small tunnel slide. "Funny how?" "You try really hard at kid stuff. Most grown-ups don't try so hard." Most grown-ups hadn't missed the first 5 years of their child's life. The hardest moments came when Daniel would mention things I should have been part of. His first tooth falling out. It was so scary, but then the tooth fairy came. Learning to ride his adapted bicycle. It took forever, but Dad ran beside me until I got it. His first day of kindergarten. I was nervous, but Mum packed my favorite cookies in my lunch. Each milestone was a reminder of what my mother's deception had cost me, but gradually I began to understand that dwelling on what I'd missed would only rob me of what I still had the chance to experience. The breaking point came 3 months into our arrangement. Daniel had been asking more questions about his cousin Michael, about why I didn't have a family of my own, about why I seemed so interested in everything about his life. "He's getting suspicious," Jennifer told me during one of our regular phone check-ins. "Yesterday he asked me if you were really our cousin, because you don't know any of the same stories about our family that he'd expect you to know." "What did you tell him?" "That families are complicated, and sometimes people lose touch and find each other again later. But Michael, I don't think we can keep this up much longer. He's too smart, and the questions are getting harder to answer." She was right. Daniel was incredibly perceptive, and the story we'd constructed was full of holes that a curious 5-year-old was bound to poke through eventually. "Maybe it's time to tell him the truth," I said. "He's 5 years old," Robert interjected. He'd been listening on speakerphone. "How do you explain to a 5-year-old that everything he's believed about his origins is a lie?" "How do you explain it to a 30-year-old?" I shot back. "At least he's young enough to adapt." We went around in circles for another hour before agreeing to think about it for a few more days. But the decision was made for us the following weekend when Daniel asked me directly. We were at the Science Museum, looking at a display about genetics and heredity. Daniel was fascinated by the information about how traits get passed down from parents to children. "See, this is why I have dark hair like Mom and Dad," he said, pointing to a diagram showing dominant and recessive genes. I froze. Daniel had dark hair, but both Robert and Jennifer were decidedly brunette, while mine was almost black. It was a small detail, but the kind of thing a bright kid might notice. "Actually," I said carefully, "you got your dark hair from your birth parents." Daniel looked up at me, confusion written across his face. "My birth parents are dead. They died in a car accident when I was a baby." The moment stretched between us, heavy with implications. In the background, I could hear other families chatting and laughing, normal people having normal museum visits. But for us, this felt like the edge of a cliff. "Daniel," I said slowly, "what if I told you that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about what happened in the past?" "What kind of mistakes?" I looked around, spotted Jennifer and Robert near the dinosaur exhibit, watching us with anxious expressions. This wasn't how we'd planned to handle this conversation, but Daniel deserved better than more lies. "Come sit down with me," I said, leading him to a bench. "I need to tell you something very important." I took a deep breath, trying to find words that a 5-year-old could understand. "You know how much Mom and Dad love you, right?" He nodded. "And you know that sometimes people make mistakes, even when they're trying to do the right thing?" Another nod, though his eyes were wary now. "Well, Daniel, your birth parents didn't die in a car accident. That was a mistake, a story that grown-ups told, because they thought it would be easier. The truth is, your birth parents are alive." His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, surprise, and something that might have been fear. "They are?" "Yes. And Daniel, I'm your birth father." The words hung in the air between us. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, processing this information with the same serious concentration he applied to everything else. "You're my real dad?" he asked finally. "Robert is your real dad," I said quickly. "He's the one who's taken care of you and loved you every day of your life. I'm your biological father, the one whose genes gave you that dark hair and stubborn chin." "Then why didn't you take care of me?" The question I'd been dreading, asked with the devastating directness that only children possess. "Because I didn't know you were alive," I said. "Someone made a very big mistake and told me you had died when you were born. I spent 5 years thinking you were gone." Daniel absorbed this, his small face grave. "That's a really big mistake." "Yes, it was." "Are you mad at Mom and Dad for taking care of me?" "Oh, Daniel, no. I'm grateful to them. They love you so much, and they've taken such good care of you. I could never be mad about that. He was quiet for several minutes, working through the implications of what I'd told him. Finally, he looked up at me with those dark eyes that were so much like my own. So now I have 3 parents? Despite everything, I smiled. I guess you do. That's pretty cool. Most kids only have 2. Jennifer and Robert had approached during our conversation, and I could see Jennifer wiping away tears while Robert's jaw was set in that protective way I'd come to recognize. "Are you okay, buddy?" Robert asked, crouching down to Daniel's level. Daniel looked between all 3 of us, his adoptive parents who had raised him with such love, and his biological father who had only recently entered his life. "I think so," he said slowly. "It's a lot to think about." "Yes, it is," Jennifer agreed, sitting down beside him on the bench. "And it's okay if you need time to think about it, or if you have questions, or if you feel confused." "I do have questions," Daniel said. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Well, if you're my biological dad, do I have a biological mom too?" My heart clenched. "Yes, you do. Her name is Sarah." "Where is she?" "We're not married anymore, Daniel. After we thought you had died, we got divorced. It was too sad for us to stay together." He processed this with the same serious attention he'd given everything else. "Does she know I'm alive now?" I realized with a start that I hadn't even considered Sarah in all of this. My ex-wife, who had gone through the same grief and loss that I had, who had no idea that the child we'd mourned was alive and thriving just 20 minutes from where we'd lived together. "No," I admitted. "She doesn't know yet." "Will you tell her?" "Do you want me to?" Daniel considered this carefully. "I think so. If I was someone's mom and I thought my kid was dead, but he really wasn't, I'd want to know." Out of the mouths of babes. That night, after taking Daniel home and enduring an emotional conversation with the Morrisons about how to move forward, I found myself sitting in my truck outside Sarah's apartment complex. I'd looked up her address online. She lived in a tidy complex on the other side of town, had gone back to using her maiden name, worked as a marketing director for a tech company. I sat there for over an hour trying to figure out how to approach her. How do you call up your ex-wife and tell her that the child whose death destroyed your marriage is actually alive and has been living 20 minutes away for the past 5 years? In the end, I called her. "Hello?" Her voice sounded older, more cautious than I remembered. "Sarah, it's Michael." A long pause. "Michael. Hi. Is everything okay?" "I need to see you." "There's something I need to tell you, and I can't do it over the phone. Michael, we've been divorced for 3 years. If this is about... It's about Daniel." Another pause, longer this time. "What about Daniel?" "He's alive, Sarah. Our son is alive." I heard her sharp intake of breath. Then nothing. For a moment, I thought she'd hung up. "Sarah." That's not funny, Michael. That's not something you joke about." "I'm not joking. I'm sitting outside your apartment complex. Can I come up?" 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Sarah's living room, a space that was unmistakably hers, with its clean lines and carefully chosen artwork. She sat across from me, still in her work clothes, looking like she'd seen a ghost. I told her everything. About my mother's deception, about finding Daniel at the school, about the Morrisons and the life they'd built with our son. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just listened with the kind of focused attention she'd always brought to crisis situations. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long time. "Show me," she said finally. "What?" "Show me a picture of him. I need to see him." I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a photo I'd taken the week before of Daniel on the swings. Sarah's hands shook as she took the phone, and I watched her face as she saw our son for the first time in 5 years. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He looks just like you did at that age. He has your smile." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the photo. "He's so beautiful, and so big. He's gotten so big." "He's amazing, Sarah. He's funny and smart and brave. The Morrisons have done an incredible job with him. The Morrisons? His adoptive parents. They're good people. They love him. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I want to see him. I know. And I think he'd like to meet you, too. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotional meetings and difficult conversations. Sarah met with the Morrisons, going through the same process of grief and anger and tentative hope that I had experienced. She met Daniel at the same park where I'd first been introduced to him as his cousin, and I watched her struggle not to break down as our son showed her his dinosaur drawings and demonstrated his robot dance. Daniel, for his part, took the appearance of his biological mother with the same remarkable adaptability he'd shown with everything else in his short life. He was curious about Sarah, asked her questions about what she was like when she was little, wanted to know if she liked the same foods he did. "Do you and Michael live together?" he asked during one of our group outings. "No, sweetie," Sarah replied. "We used to be married, but now we're not." "Like Mum and Dad Morrison are married?" "Yes, like that." Daniel processed this information with his usual gravity. "So I have 5 parents now? That's a lot of parents." "It is a lot," Sarah agreed. "But you know what? That just means a lot of people love you very much." We developed a new routine over the following months. Scheduled visits that included both Sarah and me, family outings that allowed Daniel to spend time with all his parents while maintaining the stability of his primary home with the Morrisons. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, scheduling conflicts, and the constant underlying tension of a situation built on years of lies and deception. But it worked. Daniel thrived with the expanded attention and love. He began to see his unique family situation not as something strange or complicated, but as something special. He was the kid with 5 parents who all showed up to his school plays and soccer games. He had more people to call when he needed help with homework, more laps to sit in during movie nights, more voices cheering him on when he accomplished something difficult. One evening in December, almost a year after I'd first learned Daniel was alive, I was helping him with a school project about family trees. We were sitting at the Morrisons' kitchen table, surrounded by poster board and coloured markers, trying to figure out how to map out his admittedly complex family structure. "This is harder than regular family trees," Daniel observed, chewing on the end of his marker. "Yeah, it is," I agreed. "Your family is pretty unique." He looked up at me with those serious dark eyes. "Michael, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you sad that you missed when I was little?" The question caught me off guard. We'd talked about the circumstances of our separation, but Daniel had never asked about my feelings about it before. "Yes," I said honestly. "I'm very sad that I missed those years. I missed your first steps, your first words, your first day of school. I missed a lot of important things." He nodded thoughtfully. "But you're here now." "Yes, I'm here now. And I'm not little anymore, so there's still lots of stuff you won't miss, like when I learn to drive a car, and when I graduate from high school, and when I get married." My throat tightened. "That's true. So really, you only missed the beginning part. There's still a whole bunch of life left. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed." "Daniel, how did you get so wise?" I asked. He grinned, that brilliant smile that could light up a room. "I think I got it from all my parents. 5 parents means 5 times the wisdom, right?" I laughed, ruffling his dark hair. "I think you're right about that." As I looked around the Morrison kitchen at the artwork covering the refrigerator, the adaptive equipment that helped Daniel reach the higher shelves, the family photos that now included Sarah and me alongside Robert and Jennifer, I realized something profound had shifted in my understanding of what family meant. For years, I'd been focused on what I'd lost, what had been taken from me, what I'd missed. But Daniel was right. I hadn't missed everything. I'd missed the beginning, but I was here for the rest of it. And maybe that was enough. My mother and I had eventually reconciled, though our relationship would never be the same. She'd met Daniel several times, and I could see the guilt in her eyes every time she looked at him. She'd tried to apologize again, to explain her reasoning, but I'd stopped her. "It's done," I told her. "You can't undo it, and I can't either. The only thing we can do now is move forward." She'd cried then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. "I thought I was protecting you," she'd whispered. "I thought it would be easier if you believed he was gone." "Easier for who?" I'd asked. She hadn't had an answer for that. But as I sat in that warm kitchen, watching my son carefully draw lines connecting all the people who loved him, I found myself thinking that maybe, in some twisted way, things had worked out as they were supposed to. Daniel had gotten the parents he needed during his most critical years, people with the resources, knowledge, and dedication to help him navigate his physical challenges. Sarah and I had both grown as people during our years apart, become more capable of handling the complex emotions and responsibilities that came with this situation. And Daniel had become exactly who he was supposed to be, a confident, happy, resilient kid who saw his differences as just part of what made him special. That night, as I tucked Daniel into bed, a privilege I'd only recently been granted, he looked up at me with those dark eyes that were so much like my own. "I'm glad you found me," he said quietly. "I'm glad I found you too, buddy." "Even though it took a really long time?" "Even though it took a really long time." He smiled and closed his eyes, and I sat there for a moment longer, watching him settle into sleep. My son, alive, healthy, loved, and exactly where he belonged. It hadn't been the life any of us had planned. It had been built on lies and loss and the kind of pain that changes you at a cellular level. But it was our life, complicated and messy, and beautiful in ways I never could have imagined. As I turned off his bedroom light and quietly closed the door, I realized that maybe that was enough. Maybe it was more than enough. Maybe it was everything.